Lacan's right. We need to start with the graph of desire. But first and foremost, let's talk about this praying mantis business. The praying mantis is key. So the passage comes to us at the bottom of page 5. Notice the last sentence of the last full paragraph. He's looking for a formula that will help him understand the essential relationship between anxiety and the desire of the other. That's what's at stake here. In order to understand anxiety, we have to understand desire, and not just any desire, the desire of a big O other. We're going to talk about all of these terms. We're going to get them all ironed out for you. Enough for you to at least diagnose your parents. Okay, so here's the fable. For those who weren't there, he says on page 5, the amusing image I briefly set out before you. Myself donning the animal mask with which the sorcerer in the cave of three brothers is covered. I pictured myself faced with another animal, a real one this time, taken to be a gigantic, for the sake of story, a praying mantis. Since I didn't know which mask I was wearing, you can easily imagine that I had some reason not to feel reassured in the event that by chance this mask might have been just what it took to lead my partner into some error as to my identity. The whole thing was well underscored by the fact that, as I confessed, I couldn't see my own image in the enigmatic mirror of the ocular globe. Okay, so what we have here at the opening of Seminar 10 is this weird kind of elusive reference to some weird praying mantis example that he's working out. Here's how we figure this. There's Lacan. No, imagine yourself. You're wearing a praying mantis mask, and you don't know if you're wearing the male or the female praying mantis mask. And along comes some horny female praying mantis. Now, if you know anything about these insects, you know that the female is huge, much larger than the male. And that after sex, the female bites the head off the male. So they engage in some kind of there's some fuck killing that's happening there. Now, you don't know whether you're wearing the male or the female mask. If you're wearing the male mask, you're fucked. Well, I mean, you're about to have this incredible experience. You're going to have sex with a big, sexy, horny, praying mantis woman thing, and then she's going to kill you. She's going to rip your head off. Okay, that's a pretty horrifying prospect, right? If, however, you're wearing the female mask, chances are she's just going to pass right by you. Many people would rather assume, this is Lacan's point, that they are wearing the male mask and about to be fuck killed than to deal with the ambiguity of not knowing what's about to come. Anxiety is not knowing what's about to come, but fully realizing that you are somehow, potentially more or less, bound up with a desirous big other. So Lacan's playing with the idea of the big other. Here it's a little O other that just happens to be huge. Anxiety is feeling that you are caught up, smothered, engulfed is a great word for this, engulfed by the desire of a much more powerful being than you. But you don't know what they're going to do with you. You just know that you're going to get somehow fuck killed, or you suspect that's a possibility. Now, obviously here, you are the child. And the horny female praying mantis is the primary caregiver. This is, according to Lacan, the source of anxiety. More often than not, it is a child confronting the overwhelming engulfing, inescapable desirousness of a primary caregiver. Now, this could be you as a child and your parents flaunting their adult organs around you. It could be you as a child with a single parent who's oftentimes bringing home different partners. It could be you as a child, perhaps with a parent making some sort of sexual reference in front of you, maybe even horribly so to you. It could also be just having a primary caregiver that cried a little too much, that seemed a little bit unstable. Someone, in other words, who did not provide a containing environment for you, who was not able to allow you to feel held. But instead you feel endangered, with them as the primary source of this danger. Okay, this is what he's up to with the praying mantis example. The key question comes on page 6. Chevois, right? You can see this in his essay on the subversion of the subject and the dialectic of desire. It's published in EURIAS. You can check it out. Let me know if you need a copy. I'll happily send it to you. Here he's just kind of summarizing this stuff. As you move down on page 6, you see in italics, what does the other want with me? That's the question that you have to face, and you're asking as this female praying mantis approaches you. What do they want with me? But the French word for me here is moi, which you also know gives Lacan the little italicized M that means ego, which is why a couple lines down he says, but also a suspended questioning that directly concerns the ego. Not how does he want me, but, and here's the key question. It's kind of wonky the way the translator has put it, but it works. What does he want concerning this place of the ego? What does the other want with me at the level of my ego? What are they asking of me, not at the level of the unconscious, not at the level of my split subjectivity, but me at the level of my ego? And the ego, if we can just do some shorthand work here, is this very fragile composite figure that's formed out of a hodgepodge of feeling woefully insecure, fragmented, divided, uncertain, and then coupling that with all of these ideal egos, these specular images of people who we think are awesome, a parent, a model, a celebrity, an athlete, and we squeeze those things together. I feel really inadequate, but someone once told me I look like somebody who I believe is beautiful. And the ego is some figure that tries to hold all that shit together. In the Freudian sense, we have the ego as a kind of referee that's constantly waging and monitoring a battle between the id and the superego. For Lacan, it's kind of like a hyperactive sense of self that is always trying to, and quote me on this, keep its shit together. The ego is the part of us that is always trying to appear as though we know what time it is, know how to dance, have our heads screwed on right. I'm purposefully using these kind of like bumper sticker slogans. The principle that guides the ego, Freud had this right, is the reality principle. The ego knows how to wait in line and not murder somebody. Although I have to admit, I just got a fart app for my phone, and I've been practicing with this in line. It is so epic. It's so epic. The toughest part is just keeping a straight face. So I'll be in line and I have this like fart app, and so I'll do a really long fart, and then there's a long pause, and then I'll do a little short fart, and then I try and turn to the person behind me and I just say, I'm sorry, and then just keep moving forward. I don't know. I haven't gotten much in terms of good reactions from this, but it's a gross violation of everything the ego stands for. The ego at most is going to fart silently and hope for the best. Maybe throw a little bit of shade at the person behind you in line. The ego adheres to this reality principle that says, I know how to wait in line and not shit myself. That's the ego at work. It's somebody who, I say it again, the part of us that knows how to keep its shit together. And so the question here about anxiety is, what does the big other want from that part of me? Why is the big ego coming after me at that level? What aspect of my ego is the big other drawn to? Lacan says some stuff on those momentous pages 45 to 46 that we'll get to tonight about this. He suspects that in the case of the neurotic, and neurosis is about as close as any of us can come to being normal. In fact, normalcy is just what's average, what usually occurs for Lacan. Being normal, though, is not something that Lacan even considers. The closest we come to normalcy is neurosis. One shade removed is perversion, and the clinical structure past that is psychosis. What the big other wants from the ego is precisely what the ego can't bear to admit to itself. That it does not have its shit together. That it is as much, if not more so, a fragmented body than a hodgepodge of ideal egos. And Lacan is precise here. The other wants me to signal precisely what my ego can't bear to admit, namely castration. That I am not an ego, but in fact a split subjectivity. Somebody who doesn't know what they want, who is divided, confused, and dependent. In which case, what the other lacks, the cause of its desire, is a signal or a signifier of my own castration. So there's another term we have to figure out here is castration. In the neurotic, this experience produces anxiety. What we'll also see, though, is that in the case of the pervert, this is the rallying cry for jouissance. This is the opportunity structure for not anxiety, but enjoyment. The pervert wants nothing more than to show up and be your dildo. They want to be used and abused to help you reach jouissance, big other. The pervert doesn't just assume that they're wearing the male mask. The pervert says, even if I'm wearing the female mask, let's pretend it's a male one. Let's get after this thing that is your jouissance, big other. I'm the one who can get you off. The pervert goes for it. So what gives the neurotic this kind of overweening sense of anxiety, sometimes even acute anxiety, the pervert actually embraces and says, yeah, I can be that for you. I'm happy to be factored in an enigmatic way into your desire, big other. Now, the key word here is desire. Which is why on page 15 in our seminar, if you look at the top of the page, this is the end of his first lecture on anxiety. The top of 15. And with Lacan, what we know is, it's usually at the end of his seminars, at the end of a lecture, that he really kind of comes clean. I figure at some level, the guy must just look down and realize that he has spent 45 minutes drawing a weird diagram. And is like, okay. Let me just tell you what I'm really talking about. Okay. And then he just spits it out. He likes to end with something puzzling, alluring, provocative, and if he's lucky, something brilliant. And here on the top of 15, let's guess what he ends with. Notice the sentence starts at the bottom of 14. I'm not developing a psychology for you, a disquisition on the unreal reality that is called the psyche. but a disquisition on a praxis that warrants a name, erotology, from the Greek word eros, meaning sexual desire. The Greeks had lots of different terms for love and desire. Eros is one that points to sexual desire. Eros is one that also gives us the word erotic. What Lacan suggests he's developing here, in other words, is a desirology, not a psychology. If you want to understand the psychology of anxiety, Lacan says, you have to first understand what he understands as the desirology of the human subject. Next sentence, plain and simple. It's a question of desire. That's what's up with anxiety. So just as he starts with desire, so also will we. And I want to remind you again what's at stake here. Desire is the antidote to anxiety. It's by awakening desire in another that you can help them stave off anxiety. It is a defense against anxiety. And if you want me to just cut to the chase, I'll tell you why. The cause of desire is the experience of lack. Feeling like you're missing out, missing something. That's what gets desire going, lack. Anxiety is what happens when lack is missing. In other words, when lack is lacking, someone has taken that from you. When lack is lacking and you feel totally smothered and engulfed without any breathing room, it doesn't mean you feel fulfilled. It means you feel overwhelmed. That is anxiety. But in order to understand what it means for lack to be lacking, we have to first understand how lack works. And that puts us on the path of desire. And so that's where things begin for us. Hence, as we've noted, the importance of the graph of desire, which carries us back to the start of the first lecture on page 4, where he trots out this famous graph of desire that he develops in the mid to late 50s and eventually publishes in the Subversion of the Subject essay. We're going to spend some time working on it tonight. First, though, let's pause, take some questions, comments. What's on your brain, y'all? And I will do this periodically just to make sure that we're as caught up as we can be before we take the next step.
I just want to say that Lacan is so negative. I have, when I first read him, I was like completely inundated by how awesome the idea was. But then when I'm rereading him over and over again, I realized that he really counts for the negative experience of being a human.
That's so wonderfully put, yeah. And I know you don't mean it that way, Xinhua. I know you mean it as kind of like, what a pain in the ass, but he is the great thinker of the negative. And that's really important here, because what he fundamentally means by castration is prohibition. What Lacan is primarily concerned with, the great source of his thought, is negation at the level of a simple signifier, no. Don't forget, the name of the Father is the no of the Father. That's what he's messing with the name of the Father. Because in French, nom, name, sounds exactly the same as non, no. He is a negative thinker. You might even say that he belongs in this tradition of negative dialectical thought out of the Frankfurt School. He's very much in that line that extends from Hegel to Marx to the Frankfurters. He just got a French twist to it. So for Lacan, the negative is fundamental to what he's up to. In fact, I would say that what he is doing at the level of the no at the level of the nothing, at the level of the no thing. I'd say that's the molten core of his thought, particularly in the 50s and the 60s. So the negative is crucial here. I'm glad you pointed out. Maybe that's not how you intended it, but he would certainly be like, "Thank you, ma'am."
Yeah, I wonder whether wasn't he very disparaging of the positive psychology school, Maslow and all these guys?
I don't know what positive psychology means. And I'm sure there are some people out here in this audience who would be happy to weigh in on this. Do you want to follow up and just give us a little more clarity as to what you mean by that?
Positive psychology, and my knowledge is very limited, but as far as I know, it has something to do with being sick of all the tradition of exploring the unhappiness of human life and want to study the positive experiences, not just simple, what we socially label as positive, like happy, or but they're trying to talk about not the sick patients, but the humans that we all consider as has achieved great things.
Mm-hmm.
So positive psychology, that's why the infamous Maslow hierarchy of needs, on top of the sense of achievement, the individual who sort of outdid all of us and was able to completely fulfill himself. And so that's sort of Maslow's idea. Said that, and also I ran across a lot of that in my study of outdoor extreme sports, because the positive psychologist has the loudest voice to speak about, mountain climbing. It makes you feel fulfilled as a positive experience. But I, as an inherently a negative person, also a Lacanian, I was looking for, it can't be that positive. There must be something negative in there.
Yeah. Let's put a bookmark in this, and we'll see if we circle back around to it. Because the type of positivity and fulfillment that you're describing, I might suggest is the horizon for analytic technique. Lacanian analysis would end in the conditions of possibility for something like that. But the work of understanding the theory and technique of Lacanian psychoanalysis, like every good Hegelian, and don't forget that's how Lacan cut his teeth, involves passing through the negative. So that's where we find ourselves right now. And desire is very much about the negative. Not that it's a bad thing. In many ways, it's beyond good and evil, just as language is beyond good and evil. But I want to talk about this graph of desire on page 4, because this is where we start seeing a theory of desire emerging. Incidentally, desire is just that little italicized D in the upper right-hand quadrant of the graph. What's important for us is to get a sense of how we get to that little d. That little d is desire. To its left is the matheme for fantasy. And then everything above that, you see the field of castration and jouissance. We're going to have to earn that. Right now, though, I want to talk about how we get to that little d. And I want to do it by conducting an experiment, something I've never done. Some of you may find it hard to believe that this is the first time that I've actually hung oversized Post-it notes in my bedroom and surrounded my bed with colorful markers. Some of you may be surprised to see what I have constructed here in my bedroom. Hold tight, y'all. So I've been doing this virtual stuff for quite a while, and I'm a little tired of not having my whiteboards. Those of you that have been in the lecture hall with me, you know my office and my lecture halls, it's floor to ceiling whiteboards. And by God, if they're not full after every 100-minute session. And so what I've tried to do here is I've got 2 oversized Post-it notes and a bunch of my kids' markers. So hold on a second. The experiment involves us lighting this up so that I can draw some pretty pictures for you. And the picture I want to draw to start Can you all see this okay? Thumbs up. Desiree saying no. Somebody saying yeah. Okay, well, don't worry. What I'll do is after we're done with this, I will bring the camera up closer so you can see what I've drawn. And I will also take a picture of this and send it out to everybody so you'll have an image that you can zoom in and really see. And I'll do it in daylight if I can. Okay. So this bottom part of the graph of desire on page 4, you see how we have a split subject and then an arrow that leads up to a big A in a circle, and then an arrow that hooks from the big A to a little withered S in front of a big A in parens, and then the arrow zips back down to a big I next to a big A in parens. So we're not going to work on all these terms. The bottom portion of this split subject, little ia, little m, big I, big A, is basically the mirror stage. We're not going to dig into that. What we're working towards is desire. So I'm going to cut some corners here. If you want the full details, holler at me and I'll send you the lectures where I develop these things more fully. Right now, we're going to start with how Lacan develops this graph of desire. The COVID era is so ridiculous. My dog's looking at me like, what the hell is wrong with you, bro? So this chart begins, the graph of desire begins with the simple quandary. What happens when a baby cries? Here, it's symbolized by a triangle. Thumbs up, can you see this? Is it just way too far away?
No, your blur is on.
Yeah, you could turn that thing
Blur
off.
is on.
It's like a security feature thing.
Thank you, you all. Wait, how do I turn my blur off? Change background.
I got something
Oh,
that
I
says
see.
enable background blur.
Yo, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Okay, now can you see a triangle?
Yes.
Too challenging? You can see a triangle.
Yeah.
Okay, so this triangle is a baby. This is the subject of pure need. A baby in need, whatever that need is, they don't know what the need is, cries out. And they cry out, and if they're lucky, that cry reaches the ears of a big A other, here symbolized and marked as the primary caregiver. This can be a mommy, this can be a daddy, this can be an uncle, this can be a robot, this can be baby Jesus, it can be whatever you want. This big other is the primary caregiver. I mark it as PC. And this is a full other. It's not barred. It's a capital A without a line through it, which means that this is somebody who we think has all the answers. This is like the dictionary, the OED. Every single word possible to be used is in that dictionary. This is in many ways the symbolic. It is language. It is a collection of all the laws, rules, and norms that in this case might govern a family. And I remember when this came to me. My kid was about to be born. I had no idea what was going to happen. And so I called my brother. I said, bro, what am I going to do if this kid cries? I'm not going to have a clue what to do with this thing. Some of you have little kids, I see you grinning out there. He said, listen, dude, there are only 4 things that could possibly be happening. If your kid cries, first try and feed it. It's probably just hungry. I said, what if I feed it and it doesn't want to eat? Okay. Then check its diaper. Then it probably just took a shit and needs a diaper changed. Okay, I changed the diaper. I fed the kid, I changed the diaper, it's still crying. Okay, it's probably tired. Try and get it to sleep. 8 hours later, this kid will not sleep. Okay, what could possibly be going on? At that point, my brother says, just call the doctor. Those were the 4 options. Those were the 4 options, and there are only 4 options. That is the totality of every possible response I could make to the cry of a baby. Are you with me so far? That's what this big A, the big other, is. It is a locus of signifiers, a collection, a treasure trove. It is the dictionary. It is all 4 of those possibilities that my brother gave to me. Now here's what happens though. When my child cries, I can't show up and do all 4 things at once, right? I have to choose one of those things. The little s over here is italicized in lowercase, which in Lacanian terms means it's lesser than. Here, this little s next to the big A means signified according to the big A. And you don't have to get fancy with this. By signified according to the big A, we mean meaning of the child's cry as interpreted by the primary caregiver. So if big A is the interpreter of the child's cry, and they sift through all the possible responses, little s, according to big A, meaning of the child's cry according to the big other, is when I've chosen one thing. I've chosen to bring it a blanket, to bring it some food. So this is the field of meaning. Not of interpreter, but interpretation. For all the communication studies folks out there. This is when I have activated my capacity as the interpreter of a baby's cry and decided what to do with it. In this case, I decide, okay, I'm going to choose food. I'm going to guess that this cry means the kid is hungry. So I, as interpreter, will interpret the meaning of this cry as one that signals hunger. And so I bring the child food. Now, what Lacan tells us here, when he's developing the graph of desire, is that this produces something. We'll come to it in just a second. Right now, I want to suggest that we have need down here, but by the time we get to this level, signaled by the orange, we're not just dealing with the child's biomaterialistic needs. Down here, with the subject of pure need, this is like just a worm. And if you know kids, you know that at this level, they're just basic little worms, like all mammalian organisms are. There's an indoor, an outdoor, and then all these appendages and stuff that help us do worm-like shit in the world. Here, though, this is a purely biological, materialistic, not that they like to shop at Forever 21, but materialistic in the sense that they deal with material, with matter. This is bioanimality down here. What happens, though, when the big other, the adult, starts to interpret the cries and the bellows coming from this biological register, is those cries are taken out of the realm of biomateriality and brought into the realm of sociolinguistics. I write lang here for language. This is the field of signification. The child doesn't know that they're hungry. Knowledge can only occur in the field of language. All the child knows, if it knows anything, is that they're uncomfortable. They cry when they're uncomfortable, no matter what the discomfort is. Our job as primary caregivers is to interpret that cry, assign meaning to it. And that is all stuff that can only occur in the sociolinguistic field known as the symbolic. where signification can occur. So what we're doing is we're taking a cry and turning it into a signifier that means something. Okay? The word for that in Lacanian terms is not need, but demand. Demand is need articulated in language. It's need that has been encoded into the symbolic. It has been assigned some terms. That is the meaning of demand. And so if you really want to know what is up with the Lacanian registers, here it is. There's need, there's demand, above it is desire, and beyond that is drive. And the test of whether or not you know what the hell's cracking here is how high you can climb on that ladder. Right now, I'm giving you the first two rungs, need and demand. And once we understand those, desire will follow. And we can keep the drive alive another day. But for now, what I'm trying to point out to you here is how we get this figure down at the bottom. This S means subject, and the bar through it means split. It's a bar subject. Now you can imagine the two sides of this being. This process whereby the baby cries and the parent interprets that cry, assigns it meaning, brings it a blanket, over time produces a little kid, and in particular, a split subjectivity. Somebody who realizes that they can't always cry and get what they want, because eventually they learn the same language that the parent has, that the primary caregiver brings to the table, to the point that you'll hear a kid bellowing at the grocery store and the parent will say, "Use your words. I don't understand you when you cry like that." And the kid is like, "Yeah, but I just can't." And you have these children who are really struggling. They're so overwrought at a biomaterialistic level, but they're struggling to put it into words. And then, and it just, and he and then he hit me. And yeah, and your teeth are vibrating. You remember this shit when you were a kid. It was ridiculous. But that's the game. Is you have to figure out a way to articulate your needs at the level of demand. The great irony here, of course, is that when the primary caregiver says use your words, what they're really saying is use mine. It's not your language. It's their language. That's why another word for castration is alienation. To become a split subject is to allow yourself to be alienated in a language that was not your own making. You see, the English language wasn't invented to coincide with our births, right? It was here a long time before we arrived. In fact, the great signifier in the English language that is most important to you, your name, was probably chosen before you were even born. If you come from a Sicilian background like I do, your name was chosen generations before because there's a very strict rotation in terms of who gets what name. Thankfully, my parents broke with that tradition because everybody on one half of my family, they're either named Frank, Philip, Joseph, or some weird combination of those things. I got Frank Philip the first, second, junior, senior. I got Philip Frank. I got Joseph Frank. I got Joseph X. I got all these, that's all just three names. But it's all set up through this strict rotation. The firstborn will be named after the maternal grandfather. My point here is that the language that the big other subjects your cry to predates your birth and absolutely your cry. You are thrown into it. For those of you on the philosophy spectrum, this is what Heidegger means by thrownness. You are thrown into, dropped into a world that is not of your own making, and you're asked to fit into it. That is why the subject according to Lacan, is split. Because on the one hand, they are still biomaterialistic beings. In other words, they are embodied. A split subject, each of us, we are all one part embodied and another part disembodied at the level of language. We are also sociolinguistic beings. What I mean by this is that there can be and always are two versions of us. So think of it this way. There's the version of you that felt like crap after you went out partying the night before, and there you are sitting on the toilet in your nasty ass pajama pants, smelling like whatever happened last night. You're just a mess. You got vomit still on your shirt, whatever the case is. You're a beast. You feel me? You are a biomaterialistic beast. And you're sitting on the toilet about to die, and then you get your phone out. And you start looking at your pictures from the night before, and you're like, fuck, I look kind of cute in that one. And so you go to Instagram in between taking a shit and vomiting your mind out. You go to Instagram and you post the image of yourself. And there you go, looking fine, looking great, before things went south the night before. This is how it works for Lacan. There's always your IRL self, and then there's the version of you that's circulating at the level of the signifier, here at the level of the selfie. There's you, IRL, in real life, embodied, and feeling awful. I use that image very carefully because the Lacanian origin of this is the fragmented body that all infants experience as their own. And then there's the very polished, clean, put together version of you that you decide to post online, the selfie. This is you at the level of sociolinguisticality. This is you at the level of the symbolic. This is you at the level of the mother tongue. This is you also on the envelope that it's coursing its way towards you right now. This is your name on an envelope. This is your bank account information that Russian hackers just took, and you won't realize it until 6 months later. That's also a version of you. It's you at the level of the signifier, not embodied in your skin, but abstracted and existing at the level of the signifier. Now, if you read Lacan's Subversion of the Subject essay, you'll see that this is the enunciating subject. This would be the embodied person who feels the urge to speak and say shit. And then here is the grammatical subject. This is the being that appears, the part of us that appears in language. Very well represented by the vertical pronoun I. So anytime somebody uses this shifter, we call it in linguistics, I, because it shifts, whoever uses it then becomes the referent for that term I. If I say, I'm the kind of person who likes to go to the movies, I'm already split myself. There's the part of me that wants you to recognize me in society as somebody who enjoys good film, cinema. I might even say, I like to go to film festivals instead. And I want you to see me that way, because that brings certain social currency. But then there's another part of me, an embodied part of me, the part of me that felt the urge to tell you that, the part of me that feels insecure enough that I need your stamp of approval. Please see me as a cultivated being. I don't feel cultivated. I can't help but shake and carry with me my bluegrass roots everywhere I go, my Tennessee red dirt upbringing. The fact that I was born and raised in Southern Indiana. I can only hide my twang behind $20 words for so long. But by God, if I haven't learned a lot of $20 words over the years. You feel me? That part of us that feels very much like an inadequate, totally dependent, discombobulated baby is still with us. This is the origin of the split subject. What we layer on top of it is this ego stuff. And usually what we do with the embodied parts of us is we repress them. That's why I chose the image of farting earlier. At most, you're going to fart silently. Usually, this part of us gets shoved into the unconscious, which is partly why when we dream of being torn apart. Which is partly why when you have an anxiety dream, it's like you're running as fast as you can, but your legs don't work. You're trying to go down the stairs, but you're just like falling and floating and landing in weird places. You're reaching for something and you can't quite get it. It's because that's what it was like when you were a baby. That's the fragmented body that we've repressed, that memory of being this totally inadequate, woefully dependent, zero motor skill fuck up. That's why we dream of being torn apart. We dream of the part of us that we feel deep down in our bones, the insecurities. Us on the toilet. That's why I stick with these images. So here's how we get the split subject. Now, I think what we can do is return to some more desk work here, because it'll give us a chance to be a little more detailed. While that's happening, though, now's a good chance to ask some questions if you've got them.
Hey Sam, does the feeling there of that you know deep in your bones of returning to that fragmented space, does that bear anything with what he's doing with Freud's Unheimlich and the Heimlich stuff?
It does.
Okay.
It absolutely does. Das Unheimliche it means unhomely. It's the unhomely. We have it as uncanny in the English language. But what Lacan is saying here is what pops up, what appears in the space that we should experience as lack when anxiety occurs is something uncanny. It's like a version of us that is just a little bit off. And so you can think of this too in terms of like in animation, there's a term called the Valley of the Uncanny that maybe some of you have heard of. It's like this percentage. And if you've seen Polar Express, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. If you take an animated image and you make it look 95% realistic, most people are going to go along with that. But when you cross that line, I think it's like 97 or 98%. When you cross that line and it looks so close to being real that it starts to get a little freaky, and instead of enjoying it, kids are now starting to cry because pleasure has turned to horror. That's kind of what Lacan's getting at here with the uncanny. It's a kind of horrific doppelganger or a double that looks human, looks like us, but is very jacked in a way that we almost can't quite place it. Déjà vu is a kind of French version of this, where you feel like you've been somewhere before, but you can't quite figure out, even though you know you've never been there, and you can't quite figure out the link that's connecting the world you're in now and the one that you're imagining. That's the uncanny too, because you can't quite put your finger on it. Like if you watch Polar Express and you watch those fools moving around, you're like, man, I can't put my finger on that shit, but please change the channel. Turn that off. Whatever that is, like, look at the way that his eyes are moving, turn that shit off. Stop that. You just want it to stop because you can't quite put your finger on what's so weird about it. That would absolutely be the case. This is a body that looks pretty normal, but is functioning in a slightly fucked up way. They're just a little bit off. And usually we have words like intuition. You know how you get into it, you intuit sometimes when somebody is not just being nice to you because they want to be nice to you. They have an ulterior motive. You just kind of intuit. You're like, man, something's going on here. This doesn't feel right. And you'll talk about West Coast. Not everybody hears from the West Coast, but you'll hear some stuff like, yeah, man, it's just really vibey. Something was just, and that can be good things, or it can be like, the vibe was way off, man. I really can't explain it. Let me just tell you, it just felt weird, right? And so we go to all these like mystical places. You're right, Nicholas. This is exactly what Lacan has in mind. It'll get more complicated than that. The emphasis here, though, should be on horror. There's something really unsettling. That's why he's bringing up Freud's notion of das Unheimliche here. Unsettling, unhome-like. And that's why I bring up déjà vu too. It's like you've been there. You know that place the way you know your home, but it's somehow different. Something's off. So the other important part here about Unheimliche that is crucial is that it brings with it a metaphor of space and place. What Lacan is really working with here is a topological understanding of anxiety. Topos. He's thinking about the spatialization of anxiety. And the metaphors he uses from start to finish in our talk, in our lectures for today, are those of spatiality. In fact, there's a passage early on in the seminar where he talks about how much space does he need to give people in order to talk about anxiety without causing them to feel anxious. You'll note, for instance, the spatial metaphor that occurs on pages 8 to 9. This is the reason why it's great to read Lacan many times, because this is the kind of stuff you wouldn't pick up on unless you've read the whole thing and know what anxiety is about. At the bottom of page 8, I have insisted on making this last reference, which is so close to home that it might strike you as problematic, so as to indicate how I mean to put you to the question that has been mine from the start. At what distance is anxiety to be poised, so as to speak to you about it without immediately shutting it away in a cupboard and without leaving it in a vague state either? Well, my goodness, at the right distance. See, it's all about getting your spacing right. If there's no space, if somebody's up in your grill, it's not the right distance, and it makes you feel anxious. Lacan is basically like messing with fools here. I mean one that doesn't put us too close to anyone. At this familiar distance that I've evoked for you in picking up these recent references, the distance from my interlocutor who brings me his paper at the last minute, and the distance from myself who must take the risk here with my disquisition on anxiety. The risk he's taking is that he's going to say too much, too soon, and mess everybody up. He's going to cause people to feel anxious about anxiety while he's trying to teach them what it's all about, if he doesn't give them some breathing room. And then note how this ends. We're going to try and take this anxiety under our wing. That won't make it any more conspicuous. Believe me, it's really going to leave us at the opaque distance that separates us from those who are closest to us. What is the opaque distance that separates us from those who are closest to us? Except an experience of the uncanny. There's a sense in which everything we need to know is not just in the praying mantis example, but here on page 8 to 9, when he's trying to play around with the idea of how much space to give his audience to address this topic. And then you'll note from there he shifts to Heidegger, Sartre, and Freud, this little triangulation of great people who've talked about anxiety. Kierkegaard's mentioned a bit, but that's about it. So he gives them a little bit of breathing room, and then he dips into Freud with inhibition, symptom, and anxiety. That's that weird chart that pops up on page 13. And then it's all Lacan for the rest. So what he does with this kind of literature review that involves fleeting references to Heidegger, Sartre, and Freud is he's trying to give his audience some breathing room before he tries to shove a Lacanian term for anxiety down their throats. Great question about Das Unheimliche. We will be coming back to it, so we don't need to exhaust it here. What else do you have out there? Any other questions before we get back to what's at stake in this weird little chart?
I had a little.
So you go.
I just had a quick sort of backtracking a little bit when you were talking about what does the big other want from my ego, and you resolved that as wanting me to like acknowledge my fragmentation and my gross, materiality type thing. And I just scratched down, what does the other want me to desire to be? And I wonder if you feel like that fits as well, or if that's a different direction.
I think that would be an antidote to anxiety, because it puts us back on the path of desire. Yeah, that would be the thing. And that's when we really start getting into desire, which is where we're going to go next. We've done need and demand, and now I want to show you how desire unravels from that, is we're going to be addressing that very topic. How do we arrive at this famous Lacanian claim that our desire is always the desire of the other? And that's one really great way to put it. What do they want me to be? And in fact, that's really the question. It's the final question that the neurotic puts to the big other before they have no choice but to confront their own castration. And that is, what do you want from me? This is the point when the fight has gone on for 45 minutes and you lose track of what you're even fighting about. And you turn to your partner and you say, what the fuck do you want from me? Like, what do you want? Like, what's the deal? Just tell me what it is. In other words, issue a demand. Give me a demand. Tell me what it is you want so that I can either give it to you or dip. But tell me what you want. And anxiety is right around the corner, because part of what the other is dealing with is the fact that they don't know what they want, but they feel pretty invigorated by you asking. So the honest answer is, I don't know what I want from you. Please keep asking. That would be the hysterics response. The anxious response is something like this. You know what I want from you. That's what provokes anxiety. I'm like, motherfucker, I don't know what you want from me. That's why I asked. I don't know. Oh, you know. You know what I want from you. Oh my gosh, I have no idea what it is you want. No, for real, like legit, I don't know what you want from me. Oh, you know. And then you go to bed and you're like, I can't sleep. What the fuck was that all about? And that's called anxiety. So this question of what does the other want me to be, or what does the other want me to have? Having and being will be some concepts that we start messing with here too. So fundamental to what we're up to. I love this. What else y'all got before that? We're so on track. I love it.
Can you say a little bit more about the association of embodiment to repression?
Yeah, I didn't want to go too far into that because it gets into like more Freudian, like id-based stuff. But I guess what I mean to suggest is that the basic law of society is enjoy as little as possible. And what that results in typically is a repression of the erogenous zones on the human body where enjoyment is usually experienced. So we call them swimsuit zones for a reason, because it's the part of the human body, usually erogenous zones, that we never show anywhere else, except in the bedroom. It's where you don't have a tan. And that's part of what happens to embodiment once the child is introduced into the symbolic, is they start feeling insecure about their body. This is partly how Freud arrived at the castration complex. Lacan's doing a little bit of work with that, but more at the level of language. But it's fundamental here. I don't want to go too far into it, except to say that at the level of each of our bodies, according to Lacan, we still feel in our bones like babies. We still feel like we lack motor skills, like we're discombobulated, like we are the fragmented body. So the mirror stage essay is a good place to read some of this stuff. And if you don't want to read it and you just want lectures, holler at me and I'll send you a link to something that could help. But the baby in front of a mirror usually has to grapple with the experience of realizing that the baby in the mirror, the image, seems to be a better baby, more coordinated, less fragmented, probably better at competing for resources, a baby that should be the subject of our envy. And as time goes on, that part of us, the fragmented part, where we always feel like we're basically just worms, gets repressed. And it's not all that gets repressed, but it's one of the things that undergoes primary repression. And the trigger for that in the Lacanian world is what he calls in our readings the unary trait, the primal signifier that introduces the child into language. And that primal signifier is no. So let me summarize this really quickly, what I'm saying here. The basic structure of society is the law. The basic structure of the law is prohibition. Thou shalt not. And the basic thou shalt not that underpins society is thou shalt not enjoy. Now, for those of you that have been around the block, you know that when I say enjoyment, I don't mean pleasure. Pleasure is permissible. Pleasure is a comfy couch. It's the chair you're sitting in right now, I hope. It's that cozy sweatshirt that you're wearing right now. Not the suit that you didn't put on, not the pantsuit. This is instead something that feels good. Pleasure is what happens after a meal. Enjoyment is what happens when you eat too much. Enjoyment is the experience of pleasure at its outer limit, at the level of pain. So, jouissance is the word we use for enjoyment. And the reason why people don't like to translate that much from French is not so much because there's no equivalent, but because jouissance brings with it a sense of sexual enjoyment, orgasm. And so compare, for instance, the experience of orgasm, which is enjoyment, where your body seizes up, your face contorts, you make all kinds of fucking weird ass noises. Your body basically spazzes out. Think about this time. How many moments have you had an orgasm and accidentally farted at the same time? Ha, see? Y'all don't want to admit that shit, but that's real. That is the real. The real is the fart that happens in the middle of the orgasm. The orgasm itself is enjoyment. My point here, though, is that this is a body in duress. At the peak of enjoyment, you are in a state of seizure. That is jouissance. Pleasure is what happens afterwards when you drift off into a weird kind of sleep. Pleasure is what happens when you then, butt naked, walk to the fridge, get out the tub of ice cream and start eating it straight there at the counter. Right? That's pleasure. They're different. The basic prohibition of society is a prohibition against enjoyment. You can pursue pleasure, Thomas Jefferson told us, as much as you want, but don't mess with enjoyment. What it means to be genitalized is to have your enjoyment sensors reduced to a few erogenous zones. So now what the law says is you can enjoy, but only when your penis is involved. You can enjoy, but only in the swimsuit zone area. That's the site of enjoyment. If you get off and experience enjoyment involving any other body part, welcome to perversion. That's what society tells you. So to be a properly genitalized being is to live a repressed relation to your human form. And it is a form that sometimes farts when it comes. And we don't like to talk about that stuff. We're grinning right now about it because it's one of those things that is taboo. So I'm thinking of repression here, not just at the level of an individual psychology, but also at the level of a society, about taboo topics. And being a fragmented body is not something that we like to talk about. The baby that cries on the flight is one that we wish never came. The elderly person that holds us up in line or on the road is one that belongs in a retirement home. We try and take people who are differently abled and shuttle them off into all the little areas where they can be out of the way for the rest of us. That's one way that society represses embodiment at the level of fragmentation, at the level of feeling inadequate. It's the same thing we do too when we get up and get dressed in the morning. There are parts of our bodies that we are proud of, that we like to show off. It may be your hair, it may be your biceps, it may be whatever the hell it is. And that's what you put forward. That's the part of your skin that you show. And then there's the part of your body that's a little bit embarrassing to you. The part that you don't like it as much. Maybe it has a scar on it. Maybe it's not as good as you wish it were. And so we figure out ways to tuck it away. Isn't this the purpose of cosmetics as well? To feature the parts of our faces and bodies that we want to show others and to hide the rest. This process of concealment and unconcealment for the Heideggerians out there is one that in Lacanian terms we can talk about in terms of repression. Now, I'm not being too technical with repression here. Notice I'm also not talking about trauma. I'm not talking about traumatic encounters with the real and the repression that comes from that. I'm not making too much fuss about primary and secondary repression. For us, for our purposes, the most important aspect of repression is the unary trait. This is the no that society dishes to us. It's the no that the parent also gave to the child when they said, no more crying, use your words. That's a prohibition. It's a prohibition against living your life like a baby any longer. Now, every time you cry, you usually experience a kind of release known as jouissance. And it's a release because it's a release from the constraints of society that says you always need to put your shit into words. And those of y'all that are therapists, you know how this works. You have clients that pass in and out of speech and tears left and right. So this is not news to you. Bear in mind too that I'm not that kind of doctor. So don't take what I'm saying here as like clinical advice in any regard. All I'm good at doing is reading Lacan and talking about what he's up to. So just hold me at that. But bear in mind that what he is really doing is trying to train clinicians. All the work that he is doing here is for an audience of clinicians who want to learn how to be better at their jobs. So I can't help but bring a little bit of that into this, even though bear in mind, I'm not that kind of doctor. So the stuff on the unary trait is 21 to 22. Key pages for us. What I want to draw from this diagram is that the process of introducing a child into language leaves a lot to be desired. This process in Lacanian terms is known as castration. It's an unfortunate choice of word. A much better word for it is the word I've been using for the past 10 minutes, prohibition. What the parent prohibits when they tell the child, to use their words. It's not a prohibition against crying. It's a prohibition against any furtherance of life where all you have access to is the cry. That is really important here. What is fundamentally prohibited is any further living without prohibition. The great start of the know of the Father, the name of the Father, of castration, is a prohibition against life without prohibition. Does that make sense? It's a weird one. It's a weird logic to wrap your heads around, but it's what Lacan asks us to do with this notion of the unary trait. Whatever language you learned, whatever your first word was, the signification of that word was always the same. The first word you heard, it wasn't your name. The function of that word was know. No more living without the signifier. No more life without language. No more crying and expecting to get what you want. Now you have words as well. And now you have to choose. Do I use my words or do I cry? And parents will say that. This is the great choice. You can either use your words and tell me what's bothering you, or you can continue to cry and we're not going to have any fun. You can use your words and then we can have ice cream afterwards, or you can continue to cry and we're not going to have any ice cream. So there are all these like more or less coercive ways that the parent forces the child into the symbolic. Now here's the deal. It's not a bad thing to be coerced into the symbolic. It's actually the great form of containment. For those of you that read Winnicott and some of the other like British object relations folks, this is the way that people feel held. This is the basis for feeling like you have a sense of self, coherence, you fit in the world. That's the job of the symbolic. Lacan believes that one of the great origins of psychosis is somebody who refuses, who repudiates, who forecloses this prohibition, who does not accept the no, who repudiates their own castration. The word castration here, obviously, we're not talking about anybody physically operating on your jump. Castration here just means that you have to give something up in order to find your place in the world, in order to get that ice cream. And what you have to give up, mind me on this, what you have to give up is any continuance of your life where you didn't have to give anything up. This is really important, and it's one of the basic missteps that Lacanian readers make all the time. They think that what the child gives up in castration, they think that what the parent prohibits when they exercise this prohibition is the feeling of wholeness and coherence that the child felt before that point, when they were just at one with their world like a lizard on a rock. They pooped when they wanted, they pissed when they wanted, people brought them food. It was a blissed out Edenic experience. Wrong. That is one of the greatest misreadings of what Lacan is doing here. Wholeness is not something that is lost when split subjectivity is found. Wholeness is something that can only be accessed after split subjectivity has been found, and only accessed as a fantasy. Adam and Eve didn't know they were in Eden until they had been kicked out. And what I would suggest is they weren't even in Eden until they got kicked out. They didn't know where the fuck they were until they got kicked out. wholeness, bliss, uteromorphic experience at the level of infancy. That is not something that we had and then subsequently lost when the signifier introduced the cut of no into us. It is something that can only be accessed in the field of the signifier as loss, as longing for, as fantasy. We weren't previously whole and then the signifier shattered us. Lacan's point is that we've always felt shattered. That's the fragmented baby. We weren't previously blissed out and then suddenly lost all that shit when we had to learn the mother tongue. Not at all. It's the sheer fact that the mother tongue divides us between bioanimalistic urges, Freudians hear the id, and the norms and rules of society, Freudians hear the superego. The sheer fact that we are now split between those two impulses is what gets us fantasizing about a world where we're not split. The fantasy of wholeness is an effect structure of the fact of fragmentation. In other words, it's just the opposite of what we often assume. Wholeness is an effect structure, a fantasy that we maintain to compensate for the difficulties of fragmentation, which are the true facts of life. The fact of life is that we are split. The fantasy of wholeness is what allows us to deal with that all too often. And you can see now how you get from the book of Genesis to the New Testament, to the promise of heaven. And you can also see why Christianity for thousands of years has been peddled to slaves and subaltern subjectivities, left and right. Because what it says over and over again is, suffer the bullshit of your lived experience, knowing that eternity, wholeness, and perfection await. Yes, you live a miserable life now, Mr. Colonized subject, but just remember, heaven awaits. Christianity is what it is, second only to capital in terms of popularity, because it plays a part in using the fantasy of wholeness to come as a defense against serious irritation about the facts of fragmentation now. So just remember what I'm getting after here. The unary trait on 21 to 22 that we're about to read is a primal no, a negation, a prohibition. And it's a prohibition against any more life without prohibition in it. So let's check it out, and then we'll take a little break. We're on page 21, toward the bottom. This subjective initium. It's a weird stuff that's happening here, and part of my job is to trot it out for you. Well, nothing other than the subjective initium I emphasized during the whole first part of my teaching last year, namely that there's no conceivable advent of a subject as such except on the basis of the prior introduction of a signifier, and the most straightforward of signifiers known as the unary trait. What I'm telling you is that the unary trait is a primal signifier, the function of which was no, N-O. The unary trait precedes the subject. In the beginning was the word. Now you see why it got us back to Eden. means that in the beginning stands the unary trait. Everything that is teachable has to preserve the stigmata of this ultra-simple initium. It's the only thing that can justify in our eyes the ideal of straightforwardness. Simplex, singularity of the trait. This is what we cause to enter the real, whether the real likes it or not. One thing is certain, it does enter it, and it has already entered before us. It's along this path that all those subjects who've been dialoguing for a few centuries now have already had to get by as best they can, with the condition that precisely, here it is, y'all, betwixt them and the real lies the field of the signifier. For it was already with the operation of the unary trait, that primal know, that they were constituted as subjects. The diagram I just did for you is showing you how this happens, how a baby is constituted as a subject. The unary trait is the parent eventually coaching the baby from the field of need into demand. And the technique of coaching in question here is prohibition, technically known as castration. In analysis, there is something that stands prior to everything we can elaborate or understand. I shall call this the presence of the other, with a capital A. And by this, here he means the symbolic, society, all the rules and norms and laws that govern your family life, your neighborhood, your social order, and the like. The other is there. It's on this path and with the same intention that we meet the indication I've already given you concerning something that goes much farther still, namely anxiety. The path in question is the path on page 4 that leads up from the big A other to that little d known as desire. The graph of desire is a trail map. His use of path here is very specific. This is a trail map for subjectivity. And everybody finds themselves right now, at this very moment, somewhere on that map. Lacan right now is talking about the pathway that gets us from the big A other who has all the answers to the experience of desire, and with it, not knowing what we want. But the point before we pause again is that he's saying that this is all in place before you emerge as a waking, talking, remembering subject. It doesn't mean you didn't exist prior to that point. You were there, all right, but you didn't have a life. You were alive, but you didn't have a life. It's in the field of the symbolic that you can have a life, an identity, a sense of self, a sense of meaning, a sense of containment. This would be the great disagreement with the object relations school, especially the Brits after Klein. Containment occurs in the field of the symbolic, not in the pre-linguistic experience of the mother-child dyad. That's not where containment occurs. In fact, that's a field of horror, real horror. And if you don't believe me, just think about the biology of an infant. 6 months old, they have a highly developed perceptual ability. They can see across the room. They can see all kinds of shit, but they can't get up and do anything about it. They can see the dog walking over to them, but they don't even know how to cry out, "Please, somebody save me from this dog." They watch the dog approach its victim and can do nothing more than watch. Lacan's belief when it comes to infancy is not that it's some uteromorphic experience of bliss. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's the lost book of Dante's Inferno. Shit is raw. Shit is animalistic. The only reason why Lacan would have liked to live to be 150, I think, is so that he could watch nature documentaries. And when you really get into some nature documentaries, yeah, it's beautiful and all, but that shit is fierce. There's some rugged business that happens out there in nature left and right. That's what it's like to be a baby. Constantly subject to the whims of a bunch of idiots. Always in danger of death. It's terrifying. The symbolic is what provides us with safety. The symbolic is what saves us. Even at the risk of neurosis. It's 7:45. What do y'all think? 5 or 10 minutes? As you can tell, I'm determined for you to get your money's worth. All right, let's take 10 minutes. Come back here at 7:57. I'll see you then, okay? All right, y'all, welcome back. All right, let's start with some questions. Sometimes a 10-minute break gives folks an opportunity to come up and be like, what the fuck was that about? So by all means, feel free to pose that question or some slightly more focused version of it.
One I have going back quite a bit, all the way back to your T chart on the giant Post-it note.
Yeah.
When you said the self is the ego, what is the signified self then?
The signified self, I would say, is usually, so you're looking at this side of it. Is this right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to put the ego over here at the level of like a grammatological subject.
Uh-huh.
And here I'm building on the, I'm kind of mixing graph 1 and graph 2 from the subversion of the subject essay, kind of leaving off all the ego work that comes along with it
Mm-hmm.
in order to combine these two things. My impulse here is to, whenever the ego is involved, is to use this as a way of describing our linguistified selves. The parts of us that usually are well represented by that great signifier I.
Then what's the other half, the signifier?
Oh, are you asking the question of signifier and signified?
Yes, kind of.
Yeah,
Like, so on one hand you wrote down ego, what do you write down on the other hand?
on the other side here,
Yeah,
I write unconscious.
unconscious. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, absolutely. And I guess if it would be helpful, I would say over here on the side of the ego with the symbolic, you're going to have signifiers and signifieds. Lacan is primarily interested in taking Saussure and flipping his image of a sign upside down in order to have the signifier, not the signified, be the primary element.
Mm-hmm.
So the instance of the unconscious is another essay from the mid-50s that you can check out, where Lacan's doing the work of having signifiers and signifieds popping at the same time, but he really wants to give pride of place to the signifier.
Mm-hmm.
See, we've got the signified up here, this little bitty withered S, if you can see it. The reason why it's small and withered, or in the case of font, it's italicized, is because Lacan is trying to say that it's not worth as much as the capital S signifier that you can see in the image that he offers for the signifier of the lack in the other, also in the same graph of desire. So here what you would see, if you can see that, is a capital S. As big as the capital A next to it, that's going to be signifier. For the purposes of this sketch over here, I would put signifiers and signifieds on the side of our socio-linguistic existence as egos. Egos are constantly wrapped up in the question of how best to signify to others my import as a self, my value, the way that I have my shit together. They're constantly, obsessively, you might even say, thinking about which signifiers can best elicit recognition as a certain type of person from another being. So I put signifiers and signifieds over there. But also please remember this, that the unconscious is structured like a language. And when Lacan says this, what he means is that the unconscious, the operational logic of the unconscious is linguistic. It also relies on signifiers and signifieds. So what's repressed into the unconscious in the case of a traumatic event is not the event itself. It's some signifier of that event. Not necessarily a synecdochic signifier that would represent the event, but maybe a metonymic signifier, some fragment of that event that captures it for you. That's what gets repressed. And that's Lacan's point too about his return to Freud in this period. He's saying, basically, all I'm doing is rereading Freud in the wake of a new discipline that he didn't have access to called linguistics. And so what he's saying is what Freud is talking about with primary and secondary repression are signifiers. Or in the case of Freud's essay on anxiety, it's all about the signal of anxiety. And Lacan's like, ding, 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 winner, winner, chicken dinner, that's a signifier, bitch. Lacan constantly wants to say that if Freud had just had access to a department of linguistics, there'd be no need for Jacques Lacan. Lacan is just linguistifying Freudian thought. And part of what he does with that is to say that the ego is wrapped up in signifiers and signifieds. But the unconscious is a repository of repressed signifiers. And it operates the same way that a language does, which allows those of us who study the history and philosophy of communication to say something like this. Just as the unconscious is structured like a language, we also know that languages have their own unconscious. The word for that is etymology, lexical history, philology. The way that a word or a phrase can have some sort of a hidden meaning. Like my dad likes to use the phrase rule of thumb. I'm like, bro, you know that was from like when people used to beat women and children. And the rule of thumb said you could legally beat these humans as long as you didn't use a stick that was bigger than your thumb. So the definition of a switch was that, I'm from Indiana, y'all, so just pardon me. But like the definition of a switch was, it was one of them sticks that could make a whipping noise as it came through the air. It was bendable, it was pliable. You weren't being beaten, you were being disciplined, learning the rule of thumb. I explained that to him, he was appalled, and yet he still uses the phrase, so go figure. Like I said, I'm not that kind of doctor. But that's an example of how language, expressions, signifiers, phrases can have their own unconscious. So the great insight between language and the unconscious is also one that's shot through with a rich understanding of signification. So it's a great question, and I would want to put signifiers on the other side too, just to be fair. And I think that in the future, maybe what I would do is, I teach this stuff all the time, but maybe what I would do is just offer, like, just post some lectures on YouTube where we're just looking at what Lacan is doing with signification and signifiers. Because everybody else can read the Freudian stuff, but then the advent of linguistics, and here I'm a professor of communication studies, could be the like helpful key that unlocks what Lacan is doing. So I appreciate that question. I think it's dynamite. What else do you all got?
Since you just brought in the Saussure piece for a second, I'm not deep with him, but that reminded me of a thought I had a while back, and I want to just check this out. So if the unconscious is structured like a language, and Saussure kind of posed that the sign like points to the arbitrariness of the sign, right? Yeah. The sign is just like a thing. There's nothing like inherently elephant about the word elephant or whatever, right? Yeah. So then the fact of its meaning, hang on, I had this was like in a chat I had with something. The fact of its standing in for a concept gains meaning in its relationship to other signs.
That's right.
Similar to the signifying chain for Lacan, right? Like it's in the retro version that you actually understand the final, you don't know what you mean until you get to the end kind of deal.
Yep, that's part of it. Yep, and what you're getting at when you dip into Saussure here is language as a differential system, where words only have meaning insofar as they connect to other words. So if I get a dictionary out and I look up the word cat, it's going to tell me like fuzzy four-legged thing. Well, in order to understand what that means, I have to also understand the meaning of the word fuzzy, which has its own entry in the dictionary. And I look up fuzzy, and fuzzy has 5 or 6 words behind it as well. And so you get this, what now in the digital age we would call a network. You get a whole network or a constellation of terms. And it's a differential network because cat doesn't equal fuzzy. But in order to understand cat, you have to understand its differential relationship to the word fuzzy. All right, who did it? Together mode. What a joke. What a cruel and unusual punishment to have us be together mode back at Stonehenge again. You know, we're going to talk about perversion. Believe it or not, the seminar on anxiety is about the clinical structure of perversion. And we're going to talk about sadism and masochism. And whoever just put us into together mode, pay attention when we get to the discussions of sadism. I'm just kidding, of course. That's the only sadistic joke I know. So yes, it is important to understand Saussure here. It's great to understand the arbitrary nature of a signifier's relationship to a signified. And here what he means here is a word in relation to its meaning or its concept. So you have in Saussure, crash course here, y'all. You have a signified and a signifier that are bound up together. There's a word and its meaning. And they're caught up together in the singular entity known as a sign. And a sign has a referent. So when I say the word lion, an image comes to your mind. And the word plus the image is the sign. And then there's that thing outside your window looking in at you right now, wishing you'd come out so it could have you for dinner. A real lion out there in the world. That would be the referent. And Saussure now is talking about how signifiers get linked up with signifieds. And Chaim's right, there's no necessary relationship. It's an arbitrary relationship. What interests Lacan most about this part of Saussure's thought is the differential relation that has to be maintained for a signifier to link up and stay linked up with a signified. In order for cat to mean a fuzzy four-legged thing, it has to exist in a differential relation to all these other terms. So the unconscious is very much like this as well. You repress one signifier from one traumatic event, and then you repress another signifier from another traumatic event, and down there in the deep, hot, molten core of yourself, these motherfuckers link up. And now you've got signifiers that are kind of hooked to each other in a differential relation. They are still connected to each other, but connected by difference. The same way you and your codependent partner are connected, but also by difference. Is this all making sense? Yeah, so that's what he's up to with Saussure. I'm happy to field a couple more questions before we launch into the next part.
Sam, I have a question. So in order to have the unconscious, you have to go through castration first?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, and it's part of the reason why there's an ambiguous relationship between psychosis and the unconscious. It's tempting, and sometimes people read Lacan as in Seminar 3 as saying that the unconscious doesn't exist for the psychotic. And it's more accurate if you read the later Lacan in the 20s on the synthome to say that actually what happens is the psychotic just has a kind of screwed up relationship to the unconscious. And the reason why their relationship to the unconscious is screwed up is because the psychotic has a broken relationship to language. It's their relationship to the symbolic that is fundamentally jacked. And let me go even more precise than that. The fundamental breakage for the psychotic relative to language is that they have repudiated the unary trait. They have refused the no. They refused prohibition. They absolutely denied it. They foreclosed it, is the technical term in English that we use. And what that did was it denied them access to a place in the symbolic. And because they have no place in the symbolic, the psychotic then has to look for even bigger others, but they're not symbolic others, they're imaginary others. Colonel Sanders, the Queen of England, Barack Obama, the Russians, they're all reading my emails. You can hear like the paranoid structure of the psychotic coming into play here. They live their life in relation to enormous imaginary others that do the work of containing them, if you will, that the symbolic does for the rest of us. We don't need the delusion. We don't need the hallucination of a giant imaginary other like aliens trying to read my mind, which is why I wear tinfoil every night. We don't need that because the symbolic holds us. Language, society, law, neighborhood gives us meaning. And the reason why it can give us meaning is because we accepted castration. We accepted the no. We said, fine, whatever, you win. I'll stop crying now and I'll use my words. And the parent immediately says, terrific, Johnny. Now that you've used your words, I know exactly what you want. You can have it. And we're going to go get ice cream. And you're mommy's little boy. You see what I'm saying? So you suddenly have an identity. You have a place. Things start to work better for you when you use your words. Little kids, for instance, they hit a lot too. They don't get what they want and they'll just like whack you over the head with some shit. And you can have a sibling who's like, use your words as they're being pushed down the stairs by a toddler. Use your words as they're being thrown off a cliff. So the idea here is that language, despite all of the violence that it really does to bodies, is an alternative to violence. It's how you get expressions like sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Now, we know that's not true. Words hurt like hell. But the idea of language as an alternative to violence is also well emblazoned in the split subject. The split subject is somebody who can choose to operationalize their socio-linguistic self without resorting to the violence that only their body can effect, if that makes sense. You have access to both. You know, right? You can talk your way as much as you can, but when you can't talk anymore, then sometimes you got to fight a fool. You got to throw hands or whatever the hell you get into. But that happens at some level. This kind of recalcitrance happens all the time in human life too. Your body, if it hasn't already, will eventually tell you no. It will resist your fantasies at the level of an injury, usually. So there are these ways that the body pushes back. And when it does so in a way that's startling and unexpected, that is called an encounter with the real. The real is that pop that your knee makes just before you collapse while talking with somebody about how much of a jogger you are. But we were talking about desire. Got time for one more question before I give you the rundown on desire here and set us up for anxiety, so to speak. All right, I'm going to take 3 passes at desire, each more complicated than the next. Ideally, 1 or 2 of these, maybe 3, are going to land for you. Each of them is going to be important in its own way. And remember what's at stake here. Desire is the antidote to anxiety. It is a defense against anxiety in the case of the neurotic. So what we're looking at now is a kind of alchemical potion. The structure, the chemical ingredients that are going to go into something that you can cook up for a client suffering from generalized adrift or acute anxiety. That's Lacan's wager here, is that if you understand how desire works, you will understand how to treat someone, maybe even your own anxiety. It's a wager. It's his wager, not mine. I'm just going to try and tell you how it works. Okay, first, recall the crying baby. The baby cries. I show up with a blanket. Now, if the child was cold I give it a blanket, the cold goes away. The child's need has been met. But when you bring a kid a blanket, you're not just bringing them some object, some material thing that can satisfy their need. You're also caring for them. What matters as much, if not more so, to the child is your attention more than the blanket, which is how you can get kids who are like, I'm hungry. And you're like, well, how about this to eat? No. How about that to eat? No. How about something along these lines? No. They're not actually hungry. If they were hungry, they'd take the first thing you gave them and eat it. If they're hungry for anything, it's your attention. So there's a difference here. When need has been met, there's some aspect of demand that lingers. Because when you bring a child a blanket, you don't just say, here, this is for your cold. You say, I'm bringing this to you because I care for you. I'm the kind of person that cares for you. I love you. That's what you tell the child. And what I would like to suggest is that the child's demand for love and affection and care is insatiable. And so is yours. Nobody on this call has ever been loved too much. You may have been smothered and felt anxious about that. You may have had a helicopter parent or partner in your life, a roommate that just never would get out of your stuff. That's not love, though. Love here means care. Love here means recognition, affection, attention. And it's insatiable. We can never get enough of it. The first definition of desire I want to give you is this. Desire is what's left of demand after need has been met. Desire is what's left of demand after need has been met. And you could even run it as a mathematical equation. Desire equals demand minus need. So here it is again. A child cries, you bring it a blanket. Their need for warmth has been satisfied. And what we know about needs is that once they're satisfied, they go away. If you have a need known as hunger, you put some food on it and it goes away. But the demand that a child has, the request is a better translation from the French. The request that the child puts forth when they cry is always also a cry for attention, for care, to be held. And that demand, and that is what's left of demand after need has been met. It's a part of the child that is insatiable, that will never get enough of your attention. That's the first and most basic understanding of desire. Desire is what's left of demand after need has been met. Because when you show up with a blanket, you're telling a child that you love them. And think about it this way too. For those of you that deal with clients that suffer from eating disorders, if every time the child cries, you show up with food, what you are communicating to that child is, anytime you feel upset, you should expect to eat. This is how we deal with you feeling upset. We feed you. Now, it doesn't take much to get from here to some pretty interesting and troubling eating disorders. If every time you cry, your primary caregiver brought you food, what they're communicating to you is, this is what it means to care for someone like you. You're the kind of person that needs to be fed. This is what it means to love you. You are loved when eating. You see? See how this goes? Whatever it is that you bring a child, you're not just bringing them something to satisfy their material need. You're also telling them that this is what you should expect from others at the register of love. This is what it means to love someone like you. So, for instance, if every time you cried, your parents said, "Shut up, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you," think about how that's going to play out. You will feel most loved by someone who ignores you. You will feel most loved when you are not attended to, and so on and so forth. So the stakes are high in how you respond to this kind of stuff. Next, level. I want to talk about 3 kinds of desire that builds on this. Desire for another, desire of another, and desire as another. I think this is a pretty important riff. It brings us one step closer to anxiety. Desire for another has to do with care. It's what we were just talking about. First and foremost, desire is for another person. It repeats the first words that were uttered on the telephone. "Come here, I want you," Edison said to Watson. "Come here, I want you." We could unpack that all day. First and foremost, though, it's a desire for care from another person, which is what we were just talking about. The desire that is left after need has been met, this remnant of demand, is a desire for another person's attention. So it's as simple as that. Desire for is care, or attention, or affection, whatever your word is. Now here's the deal, and this is how things get challenging. In order to get other people's attention, in order to elicit their care, you sometimes have to jump through some hoops. For instance, you might know that somebody that you're all crushed out on is really into alternative R&B music. You see, you know they're into alt R&B, and you might not like that shit, but you know they like it. And so here's what you think to yourself. If I start wearing some alt R&B merch around this person, they're gonna think that I'm into alt R&B, and then they're gonna be attracted to me. This is desire of. And here the word is not care, but identification. You try to identify your ways with someone else. For those of you that read Kenneth Burke and contemporary rhetorical theory. You try to make them desire you by identifying with other stuff that they're into. So if you know that they're into a particular band, and you know that you're going to see them at the bus stop at this particular time, or blah, 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 on this particular day, you might get a t-shirt that has that band name on it and hope that they notice it and strike up a conversation with you. This suggests that we dress and act in ways that we hope will make us agreeable to others, likable. In other words, desirable. It's not enough to cry. What the child realizes is that by using mommy's magic words, I can make her want me more. So I have a friend who told me that her kid was hitting a lot. And I said, "What did you do?" And she said, "I told him that I don't like to be around people that hit." And I said, "What do you mean?" She's like, "I told him that anytime he'd start hitting, I was just going to walk away and leave him there." And I said, "What did he do?" She said, "I'm pretty sure he shit his pants." And then he stopped hitting because he realized that by being a pacifistic kid he could secure his mom's desire in a way that hitting wasn't going to work. It's not that he wanted to stop hitting, it's that he wanted his mom. So in order to get care from her, he had to guess what she wants from other people, namely nonviolence, and then identify with that in order to make himself agreeable to her. So we talk a lot about kids, right? You can think about kids liking car keys, for instance. Little babies love car keys. They don't like car keys because that shit jingles and makes noises. They like car keys because every time you grab them, it means you and your desire are going somewhere away from them. It's not like the dog. The dog hears the car keys and comes running because it's like, let's do this. I'm ready for a walk. Are you ready for a walk? I'm ready for a walk. The child sees the car keys and sees your attention directed away from them. Kids love car keys for that reason. Kids also love smartphones. I would wager, as a good Lacanian, that they don't love smartphones because they have shiny, brilliant screens. They love smartphones because they see you, the primary caregiver, loving that phone. The child who sees the primary caregiver smiling at the little black flat box is going to say, "What's on that box, bitch? What's that box got that I don't have?" First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to grab that box and put it in my dirty diaper, and I'm going to run down the hallway. Or if you're a super aggressive kid, and kids do this, I'm going to put that box in the trash can. I'm going to put your phone in the toilet, because that's what I do with shit I don't like. Shit that, in other words, divides your attention and directs it away from me. But the move in grabbing the phone and grabbing the car keys is an identificatory one. It's, if I associate my ways with the phone, will you also smile at me like that? In order to have desire for another met, we oftentimes have to approximate and identify with the desire of another. Do you see where I'm going with this? This is something that occurs around the clock. It is something that occurs in the one thing that everybody on this call has done today. Guaranteed, guaranteed. Everybody on this call has looked in the mirror at least once today. That mirror is one of the ways that we approximate the desire of another. When we look in the mirror, we ask ourselves, am I desirable from another's perspective? Am I desirable? Not, do these pants make my ass look fat in the bad way, but am I desirable from another's point of view? Do I look like the kind of person that could elicit care and attention from another? And if the answer is no, you change your clothes. And if the answer is yes, you step out the door. Which brings us to the third flourish of desire, desire as. When you change your mind about an outfit in front of a mirror, you're not just approximating someone else's desire in order and in hopes of getting their attention. You are desiring like another. You are desiring as another. So this is the third move. From desire for to desire of to desire as. And this is what Lacan means in full when he says that man's desire is the desire of the other. I desire as an other. I want what you want. Which raises the question, the basic question of fantasy. What exactly is it that you want again, big other? Fantasy is a split and divided subject living their lives in relation to what they guess other people want. That's the basic fundamental fantasy, which is why it's written like this. You are an uncertain being. The lozenge means living your life in relation to, for these purposes, what you guess other people are into. And you'll notice on the graph of desire on page 4, this is the left turn out of desire. It leads straight to fantasy. You as an uncertain being, living your life in relationship to little a, which here means what you think others want. This is why on page 22, Lacan says that fantasy is the support of desire. He says it at the bottom of 22, about 6 lines up from the bottom. Fantasy is the support of desire. It props up desire. It instantiates desire. This is what it means by that. We could go on about this for, of, as structure. But in the interest of time, and with the full understanding that these are going to be recorded lectures and you can always just come back and get them whenever you want them, and ideally perhaps even transcribed, I want to move on to a more important chart, a more important graph that is a development of this stuff and brings us right to the edge of what Lacan is doing with anxiety. For that, though, I need to go back to this strange board. So bear with me a second here. Okay. So first, real quick, to summarize what we were just doing, I'll get a new marker. We were showing how the other is the basis for my desire. And I alluded to the fact that fantasy, I'll bring it out over here just to get it out of the way, is a prop for desire. So this is one of the ways that we start building up the graph of desire. Now, I delivered those lectures last summer. We're not working it now. Again, for those of you that are just now joining us, if you want my subversion of the subject lectures, I'm happy to hook you up with it. And we walk through and develop like the entire graph of desire from the ground up. I'm moving fast and loose with this stuff here tonight because I'm trying to bring us through an understanding of desire to what Lacan is up to with anxiety, the topic of this lecture series. So let's start with this final turn toward desire. And I want to bring us back to a kind of, I don't know, it's not heteronuclear, but I want to bring us back to the experience of childhood. And I want to start talking about this in a more graphic way, literally at the level of the graph. So Lacan, I believe in seminar 8, wants to talk about how desire gets jacked up. And to do that, he trots out a pretty great graph here. So here, down here, we'll have the child, the split subject, if you will. And this child has desire for another. So I'm going to put 4 right here. Can you all see this okay? You cannot? Is my background blurry again? Oh, wait, some of you are nodding yes. Okay, that's better then, right? Okay, I'll bring the camera closer as much as I can here. Desire for I have written up here, usually I just write MF because I want us to have the capacity to think about this as a motherfucker, but I like this as a maternal function. This is, or maternal figure. This doesn't mean that this is somebody with a vulva. This is not an anatomical assignment. This is a subject position that anybody can occupy. You can be a bio man, you can be a bio woman and perform the maternal function. FX means function. I would also refer to this being up here as the primary caregiver. Whoever the primary caregiver is, that is going to be the individual that performs the maternal function. It doesn't mean they're breastfeeding the child or any of these typical like anatomical actions. It just means that that is the person that the child thinks of first when they say, I want someone to care for me. That's why I put for here, desire for another. Now, what the child realizes, as we know, is that the maternal figure is not just drawn to them, but also drawn to other things, which is why I'm going to put of at this top arrow, if you can see it here. Sorry about this. Whatever it is that the child imagines the mother wanting in Lacanian algebra is symbolized by the lowercase Greek phi. This lowercase Greek phi, this is an imaginary object. It's an imaginary object, primarily because we don't actually know what the maternal figure wants. In fact, they don't even know what they want. It could be anything. This could be the phone. This could be the car keys. This could be the sibling. It could be whatever else the child thinks the maternal figure is interested in. And so what the child decides to do is identify with this imaginary object. Here again, we see desire of, verging on desire as, because the child's going to say, I also am into smartphones. Now, will you give me your attention? I like phones too. I laugh at the jokes that you laugh at. Now, will you give me your attention? So what Lacan says here is that in order for the child to meet its desire for another, sometimes they have to go a more circuitous route of identifying with something that they imagine the maternal figure to be interested in order to garner their attention. Now, what Lacan's going to say is, this is an entirely imaginary enterprise that the child is engaged in. But what he wants to note is, and yet it is functioning symbolically, because it is at one remove that the child is approximating the desire and interests of the parent. This direct path, in order to get the mom to turn her attention back toward the kid, the child has to move through this symbolic enterprise where they approximate the maternal figure's desire by identifying a certain object in the world and then linking themselves to it. So it's a very roundabout way to go, where desire is working at the level of an object that is supposed to approximate or represent it. And Lacan's point is, y'all, that's called a signifier. That's called a sign. That's a signal. This lowercase phi is a signal of maternal desire that the child imagines. And Lacan's point is, and as such, it is operating linguistically. So even though what we're dealing with here is an imaginary triangle, Lacan's point is, it is underwritten by a symbolic act. The symbolic is always already there. Now I'm going to pause here for a second, and I want to take some questions about this. Can I clarify anything? Because the next move is the crucial one. And I want to make sure we've got a good understanding of how this plays out. If you want 10 more examples, we can go that route. If you want to clarify some terms, let me know what you need.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, in the way I was sort of absorbing the information, I was thinking about Panasian's class, about, I guess it's more like object relations. You know, does mommy make baby, or does the mother, like, they sort of like symbolically make each other. Um, so when you're talking about the signifier, is that how um, the mom also teaches the child to use their intuition to hold their emotions and things like that? You know, the symbolic form of being able to withstand tolerant, you know, developing that frustration tolerance.
It could be. It could be. What Lacan via Freud would call the reality principle would be something that a kid could learn. And that would be a learning that would put them in the field of the symbolic. It's funny too, when Freud was thinking about the reality principle, it's not the pleasure principle, but the reality principle. He says, what the hell? I need a good example of this. And he was like, oh shit, I got one. Foreplay. The way that humans delay gratification and the way that they build sexual intensity at the level of foreplay is a great illustration of the reality principle, because it shows our ability to wait and endure frustration in order to achieve jouissance. And this is one of the most famous lines from the essay that gives us the graph of desire. When castration occurs, jouissance must be given up, but only in order to be regained by the law of desire. So you give up jouissance when you accept castration, but because castration puts you in the field of the symbolic, it gives you access to lack and desire. And desire is one of the pathways that can lead to jouissance. If you can figure out a way to get from desire to the drive. And we're not doing that yet, if we're going to do it at all. I told you there was need, demand, desire, and the drive. The drive is the register at which jouissance gets to be reactivated in the field of castration, in the realm of the symbolic. It could be as simple as some erotic poetry before you get busy. That would count as the reality principle. But Desiree, that also illustrates this kind of like endurance of frustration that a child would learn early on. And Lacan's point is that is the pinnacle of the symbolic, with its emphasis on the reality principle and the ability to wait and defer gratification, or at least enjoyment, more precisely. What else about this little image before I tear it to pieces with another different color? I'm still here, I'm just sorting out markers. Okay, in order to be a good Lacanian, you have to be able to count to 4. Right? Some of y'all nodding because you know exactly what this is about. You have to be able to count to 4. The problem with the object-oriented school, Desiree, that you're talking about here from Lacan's point of view, is that it can only count to 3. 1, 2, 3. The missing 4th element that Lacan is going to introduce is the paternal function. And I'll write it in a different color in hopes of making it pop. And here again, I'm going to emphasize this as a function, because I don't want to suggest that you have to be an anatomical male to perform it. Paternity doesn't have anything to do with anatomy for Lacan. It is a function. It is a subject position that anyone can occupy. And the truth is, you don't even have to be a body to occupy the paternal subject position. The maternal figure can invoke the paternal function by saying something like, just wait until your father gets home and finds out what you've been doing. Or if you want to keep it a little more abstract, if Jesus could see what you just did, he would be so proud. That invocation of a third party here, a third subject, is important. Now, what is the paternal function? It is nothing other than the name of the Father. Which, as I said earlier, is always also the no of the Father. The nom of the Father is the nom of the Father. Now, what does that mean? The no we're talking about here is a prohibitive no. It's a prohibition. It's a prohibition against something. Now, I told you earlier that the basic structure of society is the law, and the basic structure of the law is prohibition. And the basic prohibition of society is a prohibition against enjoyment. Thou shalt not enjoy. Jouissance is off limits, which is why it feels so good. Part. The paternal function is that of this prohibition. The technical word for this in Lacanian terms, again, is castration. And the move that the paternal figure makes is a prohibitive, castrating move. It is going to take something from this chart, and I'm going to draw it as best I can. The paternal function is to cut into this imaginary mother-child triad and say, nobody gets the phallus. Nobody gets it. To negate it. To subtract it. To subtract the imaginary phallus from the child's fantasy by saying the following: mommy doesn't have it, and you don't get to be it for her. That's the paternal no. It is a prohibition against ever becoming the object of the maternal figure's desire. And in this sense, its primary purpose is protection. What is introduced by this cut into the imaginary triangle is a barrier between the child and the maternal figure. It prohibits the child from dabbling in mommy's desire. And this is protective. Why? Because mommy's desire is so big, so engulfing, that it'll eat you alive. It is an important protective function. If this is not in place, if the paternal function does not cut in and subtract the imaginary phallus from the equation, the result is anxiety or perversion, if you happen to get off on anxiety. Because what happens then is that the child keeps living out this fantasy that if they could just approximate what mommy desires, then all would be well and I would get my desire for her met. The paternal function is to step in and say, no, nobody gets that. And so the way you read the paternal function as castration is to say that it marks the emergence of a symbolic lack of an imaginary object. So this is a signifier. It's a symbol of something that used to be there, but then has now been removed. Sometimes Lacan will write it also as a -1. In the Subversion of the Subject essay, you see this. If the paternal function goes well, this cut is maintained. And this little subtracted phi is precisely what's going to give you the lack needed to activate your own desire. This is what's cracking in the Lacanian world. In Seminar 10, he's suggesting that the subtracted imaginary object, saying that you can no longer guess the maternal figure's desire, is precisely what introduces a gap or a lack by way of a cut or a barrier between the child and the primary caregiver. And it's into that lack that the child can move with their own desire. When anxiety strikes, what is happening is that somehow, some way, something else is stepping in to this position. Something else is filling in, and that lack is being removed. That gap or that cut, that barrier, something is stumbling into it. Lacan at this point just tells us that something is made to appear where nothing should in fact be left. The paternal function should subtract and leave a gap or a cut or an opening or a barrier, however you want to put it, a bar, if you will, between the child and the primary caregiver. Anxiety is what happens when usually the primary caregiver just rolls right over that shit and nevertheless tries to put something new here. What that does is it effectively cancels out the object cause of the child's own desire by denying the child access to lack. This is what Lacan means when he talks about anxiety as a lack of lack. The lack that would give you an opportunity, some breathing room for your own desire to emerge, is taken from you, and you are engulfed by the desire of the big other. This is why at the end of our readings for today, you can hear Lacan describing this experience, which is just the opposite of what Freud thought. Freud thought anxiety was triggered by the subtraction of an object. Lacan's point is, no, bro, it's the opposite. Anxiety is triggered by an object that you can't escape. It's not separation from the object that triggers anxiety. It is the objects fully engulfing you. The problem that triggers anxiety is that you can't escape. So if you read at the bottom of 53, notice in the middle of page 53, Lacan starts talking about inhibitions, symptoms, and anxiety. So he's back to Freud again, right where he started our readings for today. Freud tells us, or sounds like he's telling us, that anxiety is the reaction signal to the loss of an object. Lacan comes along and says, a few lines down, anxiety isn't the signal of a lack, but of something that has to be conceived of at a duplicated level, as the failing of the support that lack provides. The paternal function, when it cuts in and interrupts the imaginary love triad that the child has with the primary caregiver, is providing a support. The cut that the paternal figure introduces is the support that only lack can provide. Don't you know that it's not longing for the maternal breast that provokes anxiety? Lacan continues on page 53, but it's imminence. What provokes anxiety is everything that announces to us, that lets us glimpse that we're going to be taken back into the lap. It is not, contrary to what is said, the rhythm of the mother's alternating presence and absence. The proof of this is that the infant revels in repeating this game of presence and absence. Here he's referring to Freud's beyond the pleasure principle and the game that little Ernest is playing, Fort Da. The security of presence is the possibility of absence, etc., etc. Nah, Lacan is getting to this. The most anguishing thing for the infant is precisely the moment when the relationship upon which he's established himself, of the lack that turns him into desire, is disrupted. Anxiety is what happens when the lack that promises to turn you into desire is disrupted. And this relationship is most disrupted when there's no possibility of any lack, when you don't have any breathing room. That is the most disruptive thing that can happen to a split subject on the verge of finding their way and themselves in the symbolic, as desiring subjects. Notice how he ends this. When there's no possibility of any lack, when the mother is on his back all the while, and especially when she's wiping his backside. This is one model of the demand that will never let up. A few lines down. Anxiety isn't about the loss of the object, but its presence. The objects aren't missing. Final line of that section. Once more, there's no lack. That's the problem. That is the cause of anxiety. When lack has somehow been supplanted. My friends, it is precisely 9 p.m. I'm happy to hang out for a bit and talk more. We got through a lot of this tonight. I'm damn impressed. And like most starts, this one requires a little bit more from me. But we touched on some key pages. We still have work to do in this section. And we're definitely going to be picking up where we leave off tonight in 2 weeks, with more under our belt, more readings by Lacan. In the meantime, let me suggest a couple of things. First, this is all going to be recorded and made available to each of you. I'll send an email out that'll give you a link to these recordings, so you can go in and listen to them all. With any amount of luck, they'll also be transcribed. But at this point, to start, I think we'll just have recordings of them. If you find yourself needing help with some of these concepts, I want to recommend this book by Dylan Evans, A Lacanian Dictionary of Psychoanalysis. It's pretty good. It's pretty reliable. I think it's a good book to have on your shelf. If money is an issue, send me an email and I will do everything I can to ensure that you receive a copy of that book, because I think it's that important. Now, with that said, I want to open this up to more questions. I realize it's 9 p.m., so if you got a dip, but I'm happy to stick around and field some more questions or comments, whatever's on your mind. Oh, and please also note that my wacky Post-it notes, I'll also take a picture of each of those and send them to you as well, so you'll have a clear image of what the hell all those scribbles are about. Anyway, floor is open. What's on your mind?
Hey, Sam, how's it going?
Great, outstanding. What's up?
So page 13, this table, I guess you'd call it. Curious kind of what's going on there. I can't really make heads or tails of what he's on about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I can make it a bit more specific, or is that good?
No, it's totally fine. Yeah. So what he's doing here is he's trying to figure out a way to deal with Freud's primary contribution on anxiety, an essay that's called Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety. So you can see the downward and to the right trend from inhibition to symptom to anxiety. Now, what Lacan wants to suggest is that somehow he's got something to offer on this topic. So at this point in the seminar, he's trying to come up with a really cute and clever way to diagnose Freud's contribution. So he's going to start with this chart that has difficulty along the chronological or x-axis and movement or mobility along the y or diachronic axis here. So if you start with inhibition, that's much less difficult to experience than embarrassment. But inhibition, and you can read what he's doing with this. So the discussion starts on page 10, and it's him kind of ramping up through like this logical tour to the meaning of each of these words. But what he wants to suggest is that as inhibition is mobilized, it becomes more and more tumultuous. So inhibition to emotion to turmoil. And then he wants to say, and as inhibitions become more challenging, they become impediments, which he refers to here as like a narcissistic capture of the subject, which is why he puts it right above the symptom, because the neurotic subject is captured by the symptoms of their own disorder. That's partly what Lacan is doing here. So when inhibition becomes difficult, more difficult, you'll see somebody who's not just inhibited, but totally tripping over themselves at the level of their symptomatology. So this is somebody who has a weird tic, who has a slip, who has, just they're symptomatic. This would be a neurotic person who's totally wrapped up in some signal or signifier of what ails them. And the word he uses here is impediment. So he wants to say that impediment is a more extremely difficult experience than inhibition. And he talks about this on page 10. So all the way through the top of page 11. And then he gets to embarrassment, which is interesting because as I read this, embarrassment is like a slight form of anxiety. What he's doing with embarrassment here is that it's us in a bind, which is interesting that he also brings this back to the word for pregnant. If you read what he's doing here with embarrassment leading up to it. Embarrassment is a split subject that is not captured and seized by their symptomatic issues, but it's somebody who has a slight form of anxiety. It suggests somebody who is bound up and confused by or with themselves. That's how I read embarrassment here. So it's more difficult than impediment, which is more difficult than inhibition. And then similarly, as you move down the chart, inhibition to emotion to turmoil, that stuff starts on page 11 and culminates in page 12. I don't think that there's much to be learned at the level of this table. Or maybe to put it a little better, I don't think that all the work that he puts into it has a significant payoff. I don't think the payoff outweighs the labor that goes into this, because we don't really learn anything except that Lacan can come up with creative charts. Like, what's up with the X's? Why aren't there X's here? Why are there X's here? Is there a way to fill this in? You might have a different experience with this, but I did not get much from that table that I found useful.
That makes me feel better about it because I was anguishing through it. There's an interesting like companion to this specific section where this, I don't know if you can see this. This lady fills in the X's. Can you see this or am I?
Oh yeah, acting out and passage to the act.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great.
And she goes through 30 pages of complex work on this. But yeah, I was feeling similarly that it would seem like a lot of labor to get to not much. So
here's the thing, you just never know. This is the nature of intellectual work, is you get into this material and sometimes there's a big payout and sometimes there's not. And that's part of why it's a gamble, and I use the word wager very seriously here.
yeah.
One thing that is worth taking away from this is that at this point, Lacan is trying to say that anxiety is not an emotion. It is an affect. Emotion is a very regulated, linguistified experience. Emotion is usually something that you can describe. You can be like, I'm angry now. I feel sad. Emotions lend themselves to language. Affects do not. Affects suggest a kind of intensification that can only be felt at the level of the body. The affect doesn't say, I'm angry. It says, ah, it screams. It suggests something beyond language, beyond expression. And I think that what Lacan is here trying to say is that what he wants to do with anxiety is put it in the field of affect, which is why on page 14, he introduces that term.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety as an affect, about 8 or 9 lines from the top. It's not an emotion, but an affect. I honestly think that's one of the primary stakes at this section. But I haven't done any of the secondary literature on this, and I usually don't. I just read the Lacan stuff. So I'm sure there are smarter people out there who have been able to get into this table and make something of it. But it sounds like, Cody, what the piece that you read, it sounded like it was not helpful.
For sure. Table. Yeah. Right.
All right. I wouldn't. I'm glad to relieve that.
I had a quick question on so with the paternal function as kind of this barrier between mother and child that kind of gets overwritten in the case of anxiety or by the mother, right? In a sense.
Yeah.
So I'm having trouble like understanding that as a lack when that, to me, that's like you're put the child is then put in the place to experience mother's lack in all of its intensity and therefore all of her desire. Right?
Yeah, I guess the idea here is that it's not his or her lack that the child is experiencing, but someone else's. And that's the issue here, is that, to put it very plainly, at the risk of making a mistake here, anxiety is when you are so caught up in someone else's lack and desire that you don't have any room to develop and experience your own.
Gotcha.
So to be precise here, Nicholas, I think what we could say is the lack that is lacking in the experience of anxiety
it's your own.
is your own. Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's okay.
That's the problem here, is that you are invited into this barred other, this desirous other. You are invited into whatever the hell it is they're going to get up to. Hence the image of the praying mantis. Whether you are turned on and ready to have some murderous sex with a female praying mantis is beside the point. You are so concerned about whether that's even an opportunity.
Right.
That you don't have a chance to decide what you might actually want. Her desire, the praying mantis's desire, is so big and so overwhelming that it deprives you of what you need to carve out your own. Does that make sense? So I see
Yeah.
what you're getting at. I think that's a really important question for clarifying what we're doing here.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it have, just because the first thing that popped into my mind was the stuff he was doing with like obsession. And the obsessive is one who believes they don't lack. So they would be the one that's so caught up almost in the ideal of perfection or this, whatever the other wants, to the point where they, you know, have to decipher what they want all the time, that they don't realize that they're lacking their own lack almost. I don't know if that made sense, but
it does. And we can chart it out on the on this field here. Bruce Fink has some pretty good charts for understanding obsession that I think are useful. So he'll usually show up and want to chart like human relationships along something like this. And so you have a split subject, and this could be a barred other too. The obsessive is somebody who can't handle the desirousness of another. It drives up the wall. So they're going to cancel this person out, but they want to claim and keep a part of that person that the obsessive feels like can complete them and make them whole.
Okay.
So the obsessive is somebody who is going to be grossed out or disgusted or repulsed by the desire of the other, but nevertheless expects the other to participate in the obsessive's desire. If that makes sense. So your desire grosses me out, but nevertheless, here's what you can do to get me off.
gotcha.
So the obsessive might have a lot to say during sex, for instance. Commandments, telling the other how to act. Hold it right there. Do that. Do this. Don't do that. Stop. Tell this. Pull my hair. All this kind of stuff. So you might have somebody who is issuing commands in a way that cancels out the desire of the other. Because, right, what if I don't enjoy pulling hair? You feel me?
Yeah.
The obsessive doesn't care about that, because all they want from you is your part, is that little a that you can give them. And the hysteric, of course, moves in the other direction. They cancel out themselves as split subject and only want to be your little a. They want to be the thing that arouses you.
Got it.
So the hysteric moves in the opposite direction. But these are two basic subtypes of neurosis, right? And common, very common, according to the clinicians that I talk with about this. But again, I'm not that kind of doctor, so you guys are.
Thank you. That's helpful.
That goes back to, I think that hits back to what I was trying to get at earlier with, like, what does the other want of my ego? Like, so it's not the, like, what do you want of me, but what do you want me to want to be? It's, you know, like, what do you want? What do you want? Just tell me what you want me to wash the dishes. I'll wash the dishes. No, I don't want you to wash the dishes. I want you to want to wash the dishes. Right. And it's that's kind of where I was going with that. So, like, I'm taking on your, or either taking on or being attacked with your desire for me to be desirous in place of my own ability to develop my own. Right. The anxiety is that I have to adopt yours. I don't get to have my own, kind of thing.
That is super interesting. There's a part of our readings for tonight that I don't understand. And I don't mean that I understand everything else, but there's a part that I feel is important that I don't quite get, but I think this brings us to it. I mentioned it earlier at the start where I tried to answer the question that Lacan poses here. What does the desirous big other want from me at the level of my ego? And what I suggested, looking at pages 45 and 46, was that the big O other in a desirous state wants me to show up and signal my castration. This is part of what Lacan is saying on 45 and 46. 46 is where it really heats up in the first full paragraph. What the neurotic shrinks back from is not castration, as Freud suggested, but from turning his castration into what the other lacks. He shrinks back from turning his castration into something positive, namely the guarantee of the function of the other. This strikes me as very important. I don't know that we've read enough of the seminar to say how this is going to play out, but there's something here about castration being used to guarantee the big other that really trips up the neurotic, that really throws them into a state of anxiety. That somehow the other answers the question, what do you want, by saying, I want you to show up and show me how messed up you are. Show me how dependent you are on me. And I guess maybe the source of anxiety here is that you might realize that the big other needs that. So in other words, they might depend on your dependency. And that's kind of a scary place to be, an anxious place to be, because they're supposed to be the great container, the holder that guarantees our identity. But instead, what they would be doing is saying, I depend on your subservience to me. Kind of reminds me of the scene in Family Guy, if you watch this show, where Peter Griffin commissions a series of taglines from his father-in-law that he wants to be able to use. And so, for instance, one tagline is, if somebody's complaining, Peter's supposed to respond, take it up with my ass. It's the only one who gives a crap. So he has a series of taglines that he will use. One of them, though, is relevant here. It's shape up or show me your balls. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but in this context, it might be. Maybe what the big other is demanding in this moment is show me your balls, or at least where they used to be. Symbolically speaking, show me that you don't have them. That's what I like. So I find this to be kind of a riddle, 45 to 46. There's also some good stuff on this on page 53 as well, because it's the neurotic's demand that the big other tell them what they want. Tell me what you want from me. Eventually, Lacan says on 53, they come up against the D0 of demand. That, in the end, we see the castration relation appear. At the far limit of demand, what pops up is castration, which I would suggest, and I'll probably start here next time, is where the neurotic stumbles into anxiety, even when they think they've escaped it. They think they've escaped it by forcing the big other to issue demands. Tell me what you want from me. Because at least by issuing a demand, they can solve the mystery that is giving them anxiety. So you can think about yourself confronted with that praying mantis and posing a question to it. What do you want from me? And you really hope it's going to answer, because that might give you a clue as to which mask you're wearing and set your mind at ease. So the neurotic thinks that they can escape anxiety by forcing the big other into a circuit of demand, forcing it to respond. Tell me what it is you want from me. But somehow there's a trap in there, because beyond that, where demands finally run out, that castration, that issue of castration pops up again. So I think this will be work that we have to do next time. I think it's the biggie. So I'm really happy that kind of you brought us back to this question of what do they want me to be? Parens for them. Now see, the pervert is somebody who says, but for real, what do you want me to be for you? I'll be whatever you want. I'll do whatever it is you want me to do. They are absolutely happy to be instrumentalized by the jouissance of the big other. That is the pervert's sexual fantasy, is to be a dildo for the big other. My only goal in life is to get you off. For the neurotic, that's like a horribly anxious position to be in. The neurotic in sex spends a lot of time thinking about whether the other person is enjoying themselves. You see, they're almost neurotic about whether the other is satisfied. They're anxious about that experience. The pervert has no doubt. I am there to fulfill your fantasies. What brings the neurotic anxiety, the pervert enjoys. That also comes up in our readings for today, and it'll be something that we'll need to talk about next time, I think. You could trace it through the graph of desire. So when desire meets fantasy, it has a choice. It can either turn right and go to a signifier of the lack in the other, or it can turn left and dip down into a signified according to a full other. The neurotic takes the left path and the pervert takes the right. The neurotic would never turn right at fantasy because that would be way too anxious to encounter a signifier of the desire, of the desirous other. The pervert, though, heads straight for it and is like, man, I sure hope you're desirous because I'm ready to satisfy that. The neurotic, though, turns left away from that, back into the image and fantasy of a full other and says, listen, you're the one with all the answers. I'm sure you have some answers about your own desire. So please tell me what it is that you want. Let's talk demand. At least then I don't have to experience anxiety. I may not like what it is you say you want from me, but at least I have some guidance. So that's how that would go. Well, I think that one will probably be for next time for sure. This is great. My whole goal was to outlast you all. And we're down to me and 5 more people, it looks like. So this is good. It means everybody else is satisfied, or at least tired, or perhaps just moving on, or perhaps living a life of regret in this moment, or no. Just kidding. What other questions do you all have? I'm here to serve.
Spoken like a true pervert.
Thank you, sir. May I have another? That's the thing, too, about the neurotic that we learn in these readings is that Lacan broaches a topic that analysts deal with all the time, which is, wait, my patient is neurotic, but they have perverse fantasies. And Lacan doesn't really see that as a problem. He's like, that's the nature of the neurotic, is that they have these kind of perverse fantasies, but they're just fantasies. It doesn't mean they have the clinical structure of perversion. We're going to talk about that. Oddly enough, I believe that one of the great topics in Seminar 10 is the clinical structure of perversion, notably sadism and masochism. So this is just the start of that, I suspect.
Sam, in that turn you were just talking about where the neurotic won't go up the graph to the signifier of the barred other, do you think there's the relationship between that and them being confronted with that lack? That's the anxiety provoking thing there? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if we were going to try and cram this into the graph of desire, I would say that's it.
Okay.
So one of the formulas, formula 4 that Lacan offers on, let's see, early on in the seminar here.